The Space Merchants by Frederik Pohl and C.M. Kornbluth. So this book was copyright 1953, and I have this Ballantine edition here. This is the fourth printing from Ballantine. And it was originally a shorter story called Gravy Planet that Pohl and Kornbluth expanded into this novel later. And it's a short novel. This copy I have is only 158 pages. And I got this edition a while back in a big lot of books that I got from eBay. And when I was checking out the book, I noticed there was some writing on the inside of it here. And at first I just thought it was maybe the previous owner had written something down. But then I realized it was written by Sam Moskowitz, who was a important critic and historian of science fiction in the 50s. Him and Pohl were part of the Futurians. And what Sam Moskowitz was writing in here to the owner of this book at the time, he was talking about a book he wrote called Seekers of Tomorrow. And he accidentally called the short story Gravy Train instead of its true title, which was Gravy Planet. And so he was kind of apologizing for making that mess up in his book, and he signs it at the end here with a date here of 1966. And if you look underneath here, you can see Frederik Pohl wrote a little blurb and signed it as well, and he says, "What he says is so, the idiot." So while I'd eventually like to get the true first printing from Ballantine of this one, I think I'm always going to keep this copy because of that interesting those tidbits inside of this one. And then, Frederik Pohl and C.M. Kornbluth wrote a lot together. They have some really interesting stories about how they could just go back and forth writing alternate chapters, and they just had a really interesting system of collaborating on short stories and novels together. I think they just hit it off really well together. And they did a lot of really great work until, unfortunately, C.M. Kornbluth passed away at a fairly early age. And so later on, Frederik Pohl wrote a solo sequel to this one called The Merchants' War. I haven't read this one. I haven't heard the greatest things about it. I've heard it's kind of almost a retelling of this one with just some slight differences. And you might also find this edition. This is the book club edition, and it's just called Venus Inc. You might not even know anything about, you might think this is a standalone novel or something, but when you open this up, what it is it's an omnibus of these two books put together. So if you found this one out there in the wild, that'll be both of these stories all put together in one. So with all that out of the way, let's get into what this book is about. So this is a very satirical book in a dystopian future, but the satire is done really good. It's really done in its world building. It's not really beating you over the head with a lot of absurdity and whatnot. And so I'm someone that does like satire in novels, and some of my favorite books, especially like from Kurt Vonnegut, he's known for his satire and some of his absurdism. This book is different in my opinion, and even if you don't really like a lot of satire, you still might want to give this one a read because, like I said, it's done through the world building. And then once the setup of this thing gets going, it turns into a different kind of novel. It's almost like a mystery thriller with maybe some spy elements to it. You've got these ad agencies and these corporations who are kind of at the center of this novel. And so there's a lot of like mystery and intrigue going on with the plot and our main character. And so I think everyone that's into science fiction should at least give this one a shot. It came out in 1953, and it was a reaction to some things that were going on at the time. But reading this thing in 2025 and seeing how the world has evolved, it's pretty eye-opening with what they did back here in 1953. And so I really recommend this one to everybody. But let's kind of get more into the plot now. So this is a kind of dystopian future where resources are scarce and overpopulation is kind of run rampant. And this is a common theme we see in a lot of science fiction. But here we have the major the major institutes that have power are these corporations. So political entities have kind of fallen off, and it's more these corporations running the show. I know it's hard to believe, but that's what they wrote about in 1953. And so these ad agencies are also very important to society and wielding this power, because they're taking what these corporations are making and they're marketing it to the population. Now, when they talk about the population, they don't really say people. They call them consumers. So it's like some of that world building. The word people or population is replaced with consumer in most all cases. And these companies have even exploited whole countries. So India had become just almost like a sweatshop for this company, and they take everything that India produces, they market it, and they sell it to the world, and they basically just exploited India. And now they're looking for what's next. And to keep the kind of capitalistic machine going, there had been a mission up to Venus, and one person had been the first person to kind of go check it out on a manned mission. And it's pretty horrible conditions. They know it's going to take a long time to get it really livable. They want to maybe eventually terraform it, but it was enticing enough that they're looking at Venus as the next thing to exploit and the next thing to keep the capitalistic machine going and to sell people this idea of moving to Venus and eventually start terraforming it. And so our main character, his name is Mitch, and he works for one of these ad agencies, and he ends up kind of getting put in as the main person in this role to go kind of exploit Venus. And he's got a lot of stuff kind of going on. He's got a very interesting dysfunctional relationship with his wife. He's got people that he works with that you can't tell exactly where their loyalties lie. And you've got some competing ad agencies who are kind of all thrown in the mix as well. And he even kind of befriends this guy who was the first person to do this manned mission to Venus. And so what ends up happening is somewhere along the way, our main character kind of gets waylaid, and he gets his identity stolen, and the world thinks he dies, and everybody has their social security number tattooed on their arm. So someone does a really good job to alter that tattoo on his arm and give him a different number. And so he's basically just a normal citizen now, or consumer. And he gets kind of sent down to Costa Rica against his will with his identity stolen. And he's kind of forced to work for this company that is kind of growing this lab-grown meat. And this is another bit of real interesting world building. And so they call this big glob, they call it Chicken Little. And there's people that harvest this algae, and they're called like scum skimmers, and they collect this stuff and they feed it to this big lab-grown chunk of meat. And as it grows, they can slice off pieces of Chicken Little, that's what it's called. And then they can sell this meat around the world because real meat is very scarce. Real clean water is very scarce, and air is very scarce, clean, fresh air. So if you go outside, you have to wear soot filters in your nose. And getting good, fresh, clean water is very hard to come by, but there's these addictive forms of coffee that are marketed, and as long as they're not considered harmful to people, as long as they're just addictive, then that's fine, to the point where people have to drink some of these beverages 3 times a day or they go through withdrawals. So this is a lot of the kind of world building and satire that's thrown in the beginning of this novel, leading up to where our main character here has his identity stolen. So after that, the rest of the story kind of goes through him trying to get out of this job he has in Costa Rica. It's so bad that when you include all the benefits and cost of living and all of these things that this company saddles you with, you end up going into debt with them every time you get a paycheck. So every time you get a paycheck, you just owe them more, and it kind of traps you into this profession for the rest of your life. But he's got to figure out how to get out of this situation, figure out who waylaid him, stole his identity. And there's a lot of players that were involved that we talked about up front that kind of are all kind of mixed into this conspiracy. So I would say the majority of the novel is more like that. It's him trying to figure all of this out. And eventually what this whole thing has to do with Venus and eventually even more so, there's kind of like a group that's kind of rebelling against some of these parts of society and this consumerism and stuff like that. And so he kind of gets involved in that as well. And it's just a really great novel. It wraps up really good. It's fairly thought-provoking, and reading this in 2025 is a pretty interesting experience, because I'm sure when this came out in 1953, it was probably considered a little bit more absurd than reading it right now. And I'm not saying they got everything perfect, but there's a lot of interesting things to think about in this one, especially in the context of reading it today. So, like I said, if you're a fan of science fiction and you haven't read this one, I would put this on a list to read at some point in the future. Even if you're not into the satire, I think it's not going to beat you over the head. And I hope you enjoy it as much as I did, because this is one I'd been wanting to read for a long time, and I'm really glad I read it. So that's going to be it for that review. Next up, I'm reading The Humanoids by Jack Williamson, so just look for that one coming out next. And once again, thanks for watching.